So I want you to imagine for a moment that you were at Vivid a few weeks ago and there's a big crush of people. I don't know if you might have been there yourself, you might have seen it on the news, huge crowds of people. And you're watching, and I want you to imagine for a moment that you see a young person, a little child, and you can see that they're bumping into lots of people in the midst of the crowd. That as everybody's trying to get from one place to another, there's all sorts of bumping going on, and this little kid's being bumped by the crowd. And then she sees Dad just a little bit further ahead. Maybe she'd missed him in a moment. And she grabs the back of Dad. Dad turns around and offers her his hand and says, "Thank goodness I've got you." And neither of them let go till they get out of the crowd. Could easily happen, couldn't it? In fact, I dare say it probably did at Vivid a few weeks ago. The parallels with my little story and the story of the woman in the middle of our gospel today, it was a big gospel. It started off with a little bit about introducing Jairus and his daughter and finished off with her being raised from the dead. And in the middle, you've got the healing of the woman who's been bleeding. The way that Mark does that is he wants to say that the story in the centre is really important, it really matters. So the parallels are kind of obvious, aren't they? There's a woman who is so desperate for healing. She's tried everything. She's spent all of her money on all sorts of different doctors trying to heal her ailment, this bleeding that she's got. None of it's working. And in desperation, she says to herself, if I can just touch Jesus, if I can just reach him, I'll be healed. And there's a crowd, everybody's bumping around Jesus. They've all gathered to see him. He's the focus of their attention. It's not a drone show. They want to see Jesus. And they're all bumping around. There's a big crowd. And in the midst of that, she touches him. And he immediately notices. You know, in those crowds, if you'd been in Vivid that day and you got bumped, you wouldn't have thought too much about it. And maybe you would have noticed the difference between the touch and the bump. Maybe you wouldn't have. But Jesus does. Jesus notices the touch. He feels, we're told, that power's gone out of him. Power's gone out of him. And he turns around and he says, "Who touched me?" Now, I can't be sure about this, but one of the things that we do know from lots of other stories in the Gospels is that Jesus knows what's going on usually. Okay? It's a little more complicated than that, but most of the time, he knows what's happening. He often knows what's going on inside somebody's mind and heart before they even think or say it. So, did he really not know who touched him, or was it actually for her benefit? We can't know for sure, but I suspect that when he asked who touched me, he knew exactly who it was. And this woman comes and she falls at his feet and says, "It was me." And he lifts her up, encounters her, and talks about the power of her faith and the fact that she's healed. There's something really important here about the dynamic. You know, Jesus wasn't just a guy who went around doing wondrous things. We have a story here of his power over sickness and even a story of his power over death with the little girl. He's not just a guy who's doing extraordinary, wonderful things, though. There's a significance and a purpose for them. It's to describe what life is supposed to be like, what God had originally intended from the beginning, which is that we would be able to live in perfect harmony with one another and with God. And things like sickness and death weren't part of God's original intention and plan. And so what Jesus is doing is he's restoring what was broken, restoring what has been damaged. In this case, it's a person who's suffered from this terrible ailment for so long. But it's not just that he wanted her to be healed, if you like. Not just that he wanted her to be healed, if you like. That was all it took, then he could have just been happy with the touch, right? Someone touched him, she got healed, great, mission accomplished. Jesus goes on his way. But that's not what he does. He asks this question, who touched me? She puts her hand up, falls at his knees. And what they have in that moment is an encounter. He meets her. He's not just like a divine dispensing machine of good things. He's not like, press this button for a Coke, press this button for a healing. He's a person, and he wants a personal encounter with this woman who's experienced her healing. The difference of a touch compared to a bump. I wonder whether sometimes when we come to Mass, we do that and we kind of bump into Jesus a little bit. You come to church and you kind of skate in, and I know how busy people are, and it's wonderful that you come. It's great to be here. But sometimes some people say to me, and they can be young people, but they can also be not so young people, they say, I don't get that much out of church. I'm not sure why I'm here even. I sort of do it for a little bit and then I fall away. And maybe part of the answer, at least, is that you're bumping into Mass. You've run from one thing to another, you've skated in here, and that's kind of like bumping into Jesus. And I recognise how busy people are, and it's amazing just to even make it. But when we bump into somebody, that's very different to when we actually make that intentional decision to touch someone. What does that look like when it comes to Mass? It might mean just getting here like 60 seconds earlier, sitting down in the seat, taking a deep breath and saying, Jesus, I'm here to meet you today. Or if it's at home and you're praying your prayers and you rattle them off, and then it's like, how fast can I get through them because I'm dying to go to bed? Is it just taking an extra little moment just to sit and just be aware that you're in the presence of God? I think we bump into Jesus all the time. I think we bump into him all the time because he actually wants that personal encounter with us. He wants that more than you want it. He wants that personal encounter with us. He really does. But there's all the difference in the world between somebody bumping into Jesus and this woman who goes, I'm going to touch him. I'm going to touch him. Can you hear how intentional that is? How much she wants it. How much she knows that he is what she's looking for. She touches him. And so my encouragement to us today is that we would really touch Jesus. That we really intentionally choose him. And that'll change how we show up at Mass, and it'll change how you pray. And the bumps will go, instead of a bump, it'll go to a touch, which goes into an encounter with him and a following of him. So the kids are about to make their first communion, the young people in front of me. What I'm praying for you today is that you would really touch Jesus. He's going to give himself to you in communion. Jesus does that every time we come to Mass. Doesn't matter what the priest does, so long as he does the bit where he actually prays that the bread and wine would be changed by the power of the Holy Spirit into Jesus. Isn't that amazing? Isn't that incredible? That you're not tasting a little piece of bread that, to be honest, tastes a little bit like an ice cream cone, in case you're wondering. You're actually receiving Jesus. But I want to say to you that you can bump into him, or you can go, you know what, I'm going to pay attention, I'm going to be focused, I really want to receive Jesus because I want to know the life-changing power of his presence and his love. And I really believe that. There's no one like Jesus to change somebody's life. And you can bump into him or you can touch him, and the touch makes all the difference. As we celebrate Eucharist today, for some of us it's going to be the very first time. For others, you've lost count. My invitation and encouragement to you is, how you show up matters. Don't bump into Jesus, touch him. Because he promises that he will meet you in an encounter when you touch him.